So picture this. You discover that the dirt your family's worked for a solid 100 years, the soil you've paid taxes on, poured your heart into, and always figured was yours, no question, well, technically it wasn't. Now that's not some made-up what if. Nope, that's the gut-punch reality that totally upended a small city, making everyone rethink what owning something really means. Veridia City. This right here is Veridia. Looks like any other town, nice leafy streets, a sense of history hanging in the air. But hiding in plain sight, this place had this simmering legal mess, a fight that was gonna dig deep into what property rights are all about. And the whole thing. It all came down to this tiny, almost forgotten strip of land, just a little sliver next to a really old house. For ages, the Peterson family just knew that land was theirs. It felt like an extension of their own backyard, a place for making memories, and yeah, they'd been keeping up this retaining wall, making sure it was solid and that their property stayed put. They paid taxes on it, took care of it, and honestly, nobody ever questioned it. Then, bam. The city rolls out this huge plan, a big urban revitalization project. They wanted to jazz things up, modernize Veridia, and that little overlooked patch of dirt, suddenly it was the key piece of the city's puzzle and the start of a legal headache nobody saw coming. The city's claim. The city straight up said this sliver of land was public property. Their reason? Public safety, and it all circled back to that retaining wall the Petersons had been looking after for decades. This wasn't just a tiff over property lines. It was a direct challenge to 100 years of the Petersons' claim. The court fight that followed was long, twisty, and complicated. It kicked up a huge debate about how much power cities have over long-standing private improvements, and honestly, the whole idea of private property itself. So, out here in California, the law, specifically Code of Civil Procedure Section 325, lays down some pretty tough rules for claiming land that isn't technically yours, what they call adverse possession. You gotta show you've been using it openly and obviously. That means anyone looking would see you're using it. You gotta keep using it for at least 5 years straight. And super important, you gotta have paid taxes on it during that whole time and acted like you owned it, or have something called color of title, which is basically a document that looks like it gives you ownership, but there's a catch. For the Petersons, these weren't just fancy legal words. This was their family's story playing out. They had been using that land openly and obviously for decades, for crying out loud. Fixing that retaining wall was a clear sign they were acting like owners, no doubt about it. And crucially, they'd paid taxes on it for generations, just treating it like any other part of their place. Adverse possession, the legal battleground. The city, though, they saw it a totally different way. They argued that even though the Petersons used it all the time, it didn't hit the legal mark for adverse possession. Usually, the core of their argument is proving the use was hostile, meaning against the actual owner's wishes, and that the owner knew about this claim. But when a family's been taking care of land for 100 years, paying taxes and visibly improving it, well, the ownership lines start to get pretty fuzzy. Legal history from similar situations, like that case called Smith v. City of X, really hammers home how important clear, undeniable proof is. Judges want to see solid evidence. In these kinds of squabbles, they often focus on what the person claiming the land did and whether the official owner knew or didn't know. Had the city been aware the Petersons were using and maintaining that land for so long? Did their not doing anything mean they were cool with it? And here's where the story takes a wild turn. The city ordered that retaining wall torn down, citing public safety. That's what really got this whole long legal fight going. It was a move that directly challenged the Petersons' claim and forced a showdown over who really owned that disputed strip of land. The appeals court decision on this, which we'll get into in a sec, gave a really important viewpoint. They decided the city hadn't proven they had a prescriptive easement, basically, a right to use someone else's land for a specific thing, often gained by using it for a long time. Instead, they realized that the homeowner consistently taking care of the retaining wall, plus the city basically giving it the thumbs up for years by not saying anything, actually backed up the homeowner's claim of adverse possession for that little strip of land. This ruling totally rocked things, suggesting that long-standing private improvements that nobody complained about could, in fact, beat out claims from the city. A century of silence. So, how could a piece of land that seems like it belongs to the city end up being owned by a private family for so long? It really comes down to this complicated mix of how land was used way back when, whether the city was paying attention, and the legal rules about owning property. For ages, the city of Veridia had, in a way, just ignored this little patch. They hadn't really done anything with it, and they hadn't challenged the Petersons looking after it. This long period of doing nothing, or what they call tacit acceptance, is actually a big deal in adverse possession cases. The Petersons weren't trying to pull a fast one and steal land. They were just living their lives, taking care of what they genuinely thought was theirs, a belief reinforced by 100 years of using it without anyone batting an eye, and that unspoken understanding that comes with that kind of time. They'd poured their time, their money, and their family history into this tiny plot. The city's sudden grab for ownership, kicked off by their revitalization plans, really brought up a basic question. When does a private person using land openly, visibly, and paying taxes on it for a super long time outweigh a government's dormant claim, especially when that claim only pops up again decades later? This Veridia case is a serious wake-up call that figuring out who owns property legally can be way more complicated than we usually think. It's a story about history, about the community, and about how long-established use can hold its ground against official pronouncements. Coming up next, we're gonna break down the legal arguments, dig into why the court made the decisions it did, and really get what this century-old land secret means. The stakes. What's at risk here is huge. It's not just about a small piece of land. It's about whether property rights are secure for tons of homeowners who might have similar claims from way back. It's about whether a city can just snatch back land based on old paperwork when a family has clearly treated it as their own for generations. So, what happens when a city's big development ideas crash headfirst into a family's history? What legal arguments can actually stand up against 100 years of what felt like ownership? The answers are hiding in the nitty-gritty details of the law, history, and what it really means to own land. This isn't just some local disagreement, no sir. It's a legal head-scratcher that challenges what we assume and makes us question where the lines are between public and private spaces. The Veridia City case is proof of how deeply ingrained historical use can become, and how court battles can actually redraw the lines of what's considered normal. As we keep going, we'll look closely at what the court actually found, the evidence they looked at, and the legal precedent this whole situation has created. Get ready, because you might be surprised how a seemingly tiny patch of land can become the main stage for massive questions about ownership and historical precedents. This is the century-old land secret that totally floored a city. The Petersons were standing on their property, and man, you could just feel the disbelief sinking in. The city, they just dropped a bomb, tear down that retaining wall. But for the Petersons, this wasn't just some random wall. It was like the definitive line, the thing that had marked their land for ages. Suddenly, it was this huge problem, this symbol of some bureaucratic nonsense that was messing with their whole sense of owning their place. The ground felt way less steady than it had just a few days prior. City says public safety, Petersons say it's theirs. Okay, so after the initial shock wore off, they got pretty determined. They knew they needed someone who really knew their way around property law, someone who wasn't scared to go up against the big city machine. That's when they found Sophia Mendes. She wasn't just any lawyer, nope. She had this reputation for being tough, super smart with the law, and always willing to help out folks who were up against the odds. People talked about her, you know, like a guiding light for people stuck in impossible legal jams. So there in her office, which was all bright and sunny, and Sophia starts breaking down the whole legal situation. She brings up this idea that becomes super important, adverse possession. Yeah, sometimes folks call it squatters' rights, but that's not quite right, she explained, her voice totally calm but with this underlying strength. Basically, it means if someone openly uses land that isn't legally theirs, and does it constantly for a set amount of time, they can actually end up owning it legally. She went on to explain the specifics. Here in Veridia, that time period is usually 20 years. The use has to be super obvious, nobody can be trying to hide it. It's got to be continuous, no big breaks. It has to be exclusive, meaning only they used it, not the actual owner either. And here's a big one. It has to be hostile, which in lawyer speak just means they didn't have the real owner's permission. The Petersons were glued to her words, a tiny spark of hope starting to glow. Could this weird legal thing be their way out? Sophia was quick to point out that proving adverse possession is tough, needing solid proof. But she also hinted that maybe the city's case wasn't as strong as it seemed. Sophia dove into her own digging, sifting through old city records, and what she found was, well, kinda messy. The city's paperwork for that little strip of land was surprisingly fuzzy. Old documents from way back had all sorts of confusing bits. Most importantly, there was nothing clearly stating that specific parcel was public land. There were just blanks, decades where the land in question wasn't even mentioned, or described in a way that could totally be seen as private. So, the whole legal mess kicked off when the city, claiming it was a safety issue, ordered the retaining wall down. They said it was on public land, which then sparked this long court fight about whether the city could just mess with long-standing private structures. Source: Los Angeles Times Archives, 1998. Meanwhile, Sophia started hitting the pavement. She talked to neighbors whose families had been around forever, people who remembered things from way before the current city council. Their stories told a different tale. They talked about the Petersons' neighbors before them, and then the Petersons themselves always taking care of that retaining wall. It was a constant job, years of making sure it was stable, keeping the area around it neat. One older neighbor remembered, that wall's been there forever. The folks before the Petersons, they put it in. And the Petersons, they've just kept it up since then. We always just figured it was part of their yard. These weren't just fuzzy memories, they were actual statements. They pointed to a pattern of using the land openly, constantly, and exclusively, going back way more than 20 years. The city's whole argument was basically that the wall was sticking out onto public land. But if the land hadn't been clearly marked as public, and if people had been acting like owners there for decades, openly and consistently, the city's claims started looking pretty weak. This wasn't just about a wall anymore. It was about who really owned the ground under their feet, and whether a city could just redraw property lines on a whim using old, incomplete records. California Code of Civil Procedure Section 325 lays out what you need for adverse possession. It includes using the land openly, using it constantly for 5 years, paying taxes on it, and either claiming it as your own or having some kind of title. Source: California Legislative Information. The Petersons and the people who lived there before them had pretty much checked off those boxes for way longer than just 5 years. Sophia found a spark of hope in a case that was kinda similar, Smith v. City of X. In that situation, the court really hammered home how important it was to have clear proof of ownership. The confusing nature of Veridia's own records, combined with the fact that private folks had been maintaining it all along, was starting to build a pretty strong story against what the city was saying. Sophia figured the city's whole case was built on shaky ground. The court decided the city hadn't proven they had a legal right to use the land, and that the homeowner consistently taking care of the retaining wall, plus the city just letting it happen, actually backed up the homeowner's claim of adverse possession over the disputed bit of land. Source: California Courts, Appellate Decision A165789. This ruling, even though it was from a different place, really hit on the key points of the Peterson situation. Long-term private care and the city not really being in charge. It was a strong sign of how these kinds of disputes could go. The real fight for their property had officially started. You can practically feel the buzz in that courtroom, right? Everyone's leaning in, waiting. This is the big one, the moment everything hinges on. So the city's legal crew, they're feeling pretty good about themselves, laying out their whole case. They've got these maps all marked up with dates, you know. They're saying, look, these papers prove this little piece of land has always been for everyone. Then this local history buff gets up and his whole story. Yeah, it totally backs up what the city's been saying about them owning it all along. They even go so far as to call it irrefutable evidence. But here comes Sophia, the lawyer for the homeowner. She's got her own kind of proof, and trust me, it's a game changer. Her eyes are laser-focused and her questions, super sharp. She starts this back and forth with the city's team not by yelling, but by gently poking holes in what looked like a perfectly solid argument. She really zeroes in on those old maps. "Are you absolutely sure," she asks, her voice calm but you can tell she means business, "that these landmarks on the map really show the coastline like it was over 100 years ago?" She points out these little differences, how natural things are drawn just a bit off, hinting pretty strongly that maybe those maps aren't as trustworthy as the city wants everyone to believe. You can see the doubt starting to creep onto the jury's faces. Then, bam, the real surprise. Sophia asks for a quick break. When she comes back, she's got this one plain-looking folder. And get this, it's not from some dusty old library, nope. It's from the city's own planning office. This, she announces, holding it up for all to see, is a memo. It's dated 1952. The entire courtroom goes dead silent. You can see the city lawyers starting to get a little antsy. Sophia keeps going, and you can just hear the victory in her voice. This internal memo, she says, explains how the city actually tried to buy this exact piece of land from the Peterson family. She lets that hang in the air for a second. And according to this paper, the Petersons flat out refused to sell. And wow, does that change things? If they tried to buy it, that means they didn't already own it, right? And if the family said no deal, it sure makes it sound like they thought they had the right to say no. This whole thing might not be about someone moving in where they shouldn't. It could just be about a deal that fell through years ago. So the city's whole argument, the one they built on 100 years of saying it was public land, it just totally falls apart. The court records are pretty clear, you know. California Code of Civil Procedure Section 325 basically says you gotta use the land openly, use it constantly for 5 years, and actually claim you have a right to it. What Sophia found totally throws a wrench in the city's claim of right. It shows that people actually recognized it as private property way back when. Later on, the appellate court agreed this was the key moment. They decided the city hadn't proven they had any right to use the land. Instead, they said that because the homeowner kept up that retaining wall all those years, and the city basically just let it happen, it really supported the homeowner's claim that they'd been using that disputed land as if it were theirs for a long time. And just like that, the whole situation flipped. It wasn't some big loud argument that did it, but a forgotten piece of paper, quietly holding onto a secret that was a century old. All right, check this out. That whole Veridia court thing? Man, it wasn't just a win for that one family. It totally shook things up all over the city. Boom, suddenly the city council had to, actually look at their land registry stuff again. They finally had to admit that these adverse possession claims, the ones they'd been brushing aside forever, were actually legit. This whole ruling, it became this shining light, a real symbol of one person just going up against the big, bureaucratic machine and winning. And the Petersons win, especially since it looked like they had zero chance. It got other folks thinking, you know. People started looking at what the city was claiming on their land, suddenly feeling like they actually had some power, some idea of what their rights were. This whole situation really hammers home this one super important point for anyone who owns a home. You gotta have your paperwork in order, period. Knowing your way around property law, even the weird, tucked-away parts like adverse possession, can seriously protect what's yours. You know, the California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 325 specifically, lays out what you need for those kinds of claims. It's all about using the land constantly, being super obvious about it, and genuinely believing it's yours. Source: California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 325. So how did this legal mess even start? Well, the city decided to order the demolition of a retaining wall. Their reason: they said it was sticking out onto public land. Source: Los Angeles Times, June 3, 1998. But get this. The court figured out that the homeowner had been taking care of it forever, and the city pretty much just went along with it, no complaints. That totally backed up the homeowner's claim. Source: Court Record, Appellate Decision. The judges really hammered home that you need crystal clear proof, and you see that in other similar cases too. Source: Legal Precedent, Smith v. City of X. So here's the deal. If your family's been looking after a little patch of ground for ages, you need to know what your rights are. Keep records of everything. Being on top of it now could save your property down the road. Don't let some old, forgotten detail bite you later.